Great. This section is called Cell Fuel. And the central question is, what are some important types of materials in the cells? Push here, don't push here. So I'm going to leave this here. If you guys want to stop the video and read it, you can. It's just a little more support for the content. So your first question, what are some examples of nutrients? And so try to think about the smaller parts. So bread and meat and fruits, that isn't the way they want you to answer. They want you to think about the smaller parts of those nutrients. So we're going to be talking about the word macromolecule. A molecule is a compound that has covalent bonds, and it just means atoms put together. Macro means large. So by mass and by size, these are very large molecules that is needed for life. They are made up of small parts called monomers or subunits. Monomer means one, poly means many. So a monomer is the small part, and a polymer is many of those small parts together. So you can think of it like a beaded necklace. The beads are the monomer, and the necklace itself is the polymer. Macromolecules are giant. That was strange. So macromolecules. Here are some examples to help you visualize it, some models. So large organic molecules, remember that organic means has the element carbon. So in living cells, we can put together, the cells, you have these small pieces that that the cells can put together. We make proteins from amino acids. We make nucleotides. And we build DNA. So here we have the small pieces, and with chemistry, we put those together into a polymer. Polymeration just means taking monomers and turning them into a polymer. So here are chemical formulas of the macromolecules that we're going to be talking about. I guess I should say structural formulas. So carbohydrates. Carbohydrates tend to have these ring structures. They tend to have one carbon to two hydrogens to one oxygen. For example, glucose, a simple sugar, C6H12O6. One carbon to two hydrogens to one oxygen. Glucose, C6H12O6. Most carbohydrates have monomers like simple sugars like glucose, and you put two of those together and you get a disaccharide, and then you saccharide meaning sugar, and then you put a whole bunch of them together and you get a polysaccharide, many sugars. Example of some polysaccharides would be starch. Starch is a polysaccharide, like in a potato, and really all it is very long chain of glucose molecules put together. Sugars tend to end in ose, so sucrose, fructose, lactose. Okay, next we have proteins, and proteins are made up of amino acids. For us, there's about 20 to 24 that are essential. And so they have a lot of nitrogen, proteins do, and they have different functions based on their shape. Then we have nucleic acids. You have DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and you have RNA, ribonucleic acid. Both of those are nucleic acids, and their monomers are called nucleotides. So in DNA, you have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, ATGC. In RNA, though, RNA is a little different. Instead of thymine, you have uracil. So in RNA, you still have adenine, guanine, cytosine, but instead of thymine, you have uracil. And then you have lipids. And lipids store energy for us. And so instead of writing all these carbons out, this is just a big, fat, long chain of carbons. And so that's how it stores the energy, because what the body does is it can cleave off those carbons one by one and release and make ATP for us. And so we have a big, long chain that's just simply got a lot of carbons on it. And then here at the end, this is what's called an acid group. So this is what makes it a fatty acid. So monomers and polymers. Each macromolecule that we're going to talk about has a monomer. So these are just some ways to look at that difference between a monomer and a polymer. So here, the monomer is 2 light and 1 dark. So this is the monomer, and you can see that repeating unit. So we're going to start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are used by the cell for quick energy. So sugars, starches. The body uses this in the mitochondrial level. And in the mitochondria is where these carbohydrates get broken down to release ATP. ATP. That's the molecule that the body needs to do its work. For your toe to tap, for your pencil to tap, for your heart to beat. So carbohydrates, you have simple carbohydrates like glucose, and you can have some more complex carbohydrates like starch or cellulose. Starch should help. Okay, here we go. So we need carbohydrates for our energy source. And here's an example of starch. Here we have these glucose molecules. In chemistry, if you were to look at this, you would know that each one of these corners is a carbon. You know that this is a bond. So a long stretch of glucose molecules. And if we blow that up, this is what the glucose molecule looks like. And if you counted up all the carbons, it would be 6. If you counted up all the hydrogens, it would be 12. And if you counted up all the oxygens, that would be 6. So C6H12O6. So the polymer is starch and the monomer is the glucose. Again, saccharide means sugar, mono means one, and poly means many. So some example of some simple sugars are glucose, fructose. I wonder where fructose is found. Maybe fruit. And then galactose. You put 2 monosaccharides together and you get a disaccharide. So sucrose, that's your table sugar that you put on your Wheaties, is a disaccharide. It's not a monosaccharide. Some carbohydrates are more complex and have other functions within life. And so glycogen is an example of one of those carbohydrates. And here's a picture of that glycogen. So you can see that it's way more complex. These swirlies actually have meaning, and they're actually we don't want to know, but usually these represent a protein all wound up together. And then you can see all this great funness. So it's complex. So starches and cellulose are things made by plants. Cellulose is what gives the cell wall in a plant cell its rigor or its ability to support the cell wall, the cell membrane for this plant cell to keep its shape. We can't digest cellulose. So if we had a spoonful of cellulose, it wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't do anything for us. So again, another picture of starch. And so here, again, remember, I like to actually see things. And so these are cellulose fibers in a plant cell wall. And so that's what helps keep the plant's shape. And again, this OSC indicates that it's a sugar. Here's some example of some sugars. And we've talked about what you should notice here. If I divide 12 into 24, there's one carbon for every hydrogen, and there's one oxygen for one hydrogen. So 1 to 2 to 1 is the proportion. Now on to proteins. The monomer proteins are amino acids, and you can't get everything you need. You can't get all your vitamins and amino acids from being one type of consumer. So if you're a vegetarian, you need to supplement your diet. If you are just a carnivore, you need to supplement your diet because we need these things for our metabolism and the chemistry that goes on in our body. And so the amine group, NH2, you see that's where that nitrogen pulls in. Proteins have a lot of nitrogen in them. And we tend to think of getting our proteins from meat, fish, spinach, nuts are a good source, eggs. Proteins are So the amino acid, you have an R group. And so what this R means is a whole bunch of carbon atoms. So there'd be a whole bunch of carbon here. But instead of writing all those out, they just put it as an R. Here's the amine group, and here's a carboxyl group, and this is what makes it an acid, this part over here. You don't have to know this, but just giving you things to put in your head for later. So what you need to know, a protein is made up of the monomer amino acid. So amino acids are the monomer for proteins. We talked about that there's 20 to 24 that we need in our diet. This was a nightmare for me in biochemistry. We had to memorize those. There's a special bond between amino acids called a peptide bond. Amino And so some functions of proteins besides being part of your muscles is that they're enzymes, and you'll learn that later on. But that's a different function than what we think of when we think about why we need proteins in our diet. We usually think that it helps us build up our muscles, but they serve other functions than just that. And enzymes is one of those. The atoms you're going to find are mostly going to be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur in a protein. And proteins have to be a certain shape for them to be able to work. So you get this long chain that's put together at the ribosome. So it's like a big long chain of beads, but those beads have to form a 3D shape and a very specific 3D shape. If they don't, then that protein cannot work and do its function. So some foods that you can find proteins in. Chickpeas, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't like beans either. I was forced to eat them as a kid. No beans. So some example of proteins, you got hemoglobin, you got keratin, you got collagen. Collagen is what helps keep your skin elastic. Keratin helps keep your hair strong. I'm sure you've heard of a keratin treatment. So this here just talks about that the proteins have to be a 3D shape. This is just food for your noggin. You can stop and read this if you want to. We might watch this together and we might not, but I'll post it for you. The amoeba sisters go through the four macromolecules. Okay, and I will probably give this to you as a handout, so look for that to be on your way. And so, question number 9. What are the building blocks of proteins? That should be a pretty easy one, I hope. Then we get to lipids. Lipids are long chains of carbon. What you have to know about a lipid is that they are a long-term energy source to store energy, and they help protect, and they're part of the cell membrane. And they have other cellular functions for our metabolism. So I'm just going to talk about fatty acids in general. This is stuff for your noggin. What you need to know is that fatty acids are made up of glycerol and fatty acids. They a long storage of energy and can help with waterproofing and insulation. So there's different types of lipids. You have saturated, unsaturated, and polyunsaturated. What saturated means that is that in your chain of carbons, let's say we have 200 carbons attached to each other, each one of those is going to have 2 hydrogens associated with it. It's saturated with hydrogens. If we can force the carbons to make a double bond, they'll take some of the hydrogens away, and that would make the lipid unsaturated, meaning it doesn't have all the hydrogens that it possibly could have. So saturated with hydrogens, unsaturated means that there's some double bonds between the carbons, and that has removed some of those hydrogens. And polyunsaturated means that there's many of the hydrogens that aren't there.
Lipids are macromolecules.
Oh, that's me talking. See that? I forgot I'd put that on there. Okay, so where we can find lipids, you have fats, you have oils, you have waxes. So if you wax your car, that wax helps to waterproof your car. There are good and bad lipids. So some help you and some can be harmful. When you get older, you'll pay attention to your triglycerides and pay attention to your good triglycerides and your bad triglycerides. So here's just an example of what a lipid molecule might look like. Here you have the glycerol, and here are the fatty acids. This part right here is what makes it an acid. And so this lipid here that we're looking at is unsaturated because here's some of those double bonds. If this double bond was broken, there would be another hydrogen here and another hydrogen here, and that would make this one saturated. So again, just another way of looking at it. Here, this is a saturated because it has all the hydrogens in all the possible places. So long-term energy storage, waterproofing, membrane structure. They have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Most of our hormones have a lipid component to them. Another look at saturated versus unsaturated. Here we have all possible hydrogens, so it's saturated with hydrogens. And here there's been a double bond force between the 2 carbons, which removed 2 of those hydrogens. So saturated fats tend to be solid, unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. So an example of their benefits helps keep a plant leaf waterproof. If plants weren't able to be somewhat waterproof, then they would get mold very quickly, and that would be dangerous. I don't know if we're going to talk about polar and nonpolar later, but we might. So here we are. We're at our little summary table. So you have a place to put the nutrient. I would put their monomers here. and then what functions they perform in the cell. So you can go back to your reading and put that in. Nucleic acids. The monomer of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide, and the nucleotide has three pieces to it. It has a sugar, and so in RNA, that sugar is ribose. In DNA, it's deoxyribose. What you have to know about nucleic acids, the monomer is a nucleotide, and they are where our genetic information and how to make proteins is. Everything else is just food for your noggin. So ribose, when it has an oxygen removed, becomes deoxyribose. So D means remove or without, and then oxy, the oxygen's taken out, ribose. So DNA and RNA, people are like, that's a very long word. How am I going to remember it? Well, D, you removed an oxygen, deoxyribose. They have a sugar, and they have a phosphate, and then they have a nitrogen base. And we kind of talked about that on the other side, where you have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine in DNA. And in there, that the base is different. And then when you get to RNA, you have cytosine, guanine, not thymine, you have uracil. Did I get them all? Uracil. And adenine, uracil, cytosine, and guanine. So here's a picture model of a nucleotide. Right. So here we have the sugar, here we have the phosphate, and here we have the nitrogen base. So which base is here is going to determine which kind of nucleotide it is. So if it was adenine, that would be different than a thymine. Oh, my cursor. So if we look at DNA and RNA, DNA, besides having a difference with the thymine and the uracil, DNA is double-stranded, means it has two strands of nucleotides, versus RNA only has one strand of nucleotides and it has uracil. DNA, two strands, double helix. RNA, one strand. I'm putting this stuff in here because it's good for your brain to make connections to these words, because you're going to see all this again when you go to high school, because you'll have to take biology. Just a model to help you visualize it. And so they have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And that is the end of this section. So remember, you have carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, macroorganic molecules.